Grace Anderson rushed through the busy hospital corridor, her white coat fluttering behind her as she checked her patient charts. Another typical Tuesday at Metropolitan General, filled with routine consultations and follow-ups. She smiled at Mrs. Peterson, who was making remarkable progress after her hip replacement, when her phone buzzed in her pocket. "Dr. Anderson speaking," she answered, still reviewing Mrs. Peterson's vitals. "Grace?" The trembling voice of Sandra, her mother, made her freeze. "It's your father, James. He's been admitted to the emergency room." The chart slipped from Grace's hands, scattering papers across the floor. "What? When? What happened?" "The doctors are saying something about his kidneys. They're rushing him to nephrology. Please, Grace, we need you." Grace's world tilted on its axis. She mumbled something to Mrs. Peterson and sprinted toward the nephrology wing, her mind racing back to another life-changing moment, 23 years ago. She was 7, clutching a small backpack, standing in front of the Andersons' home for the first time. James and Sandra, both white, welcoming a scared little black girl with open arms and unwavering love. The elevator seemed to crawl between floors. Grace pressed her forehead against the cool metal wall, remembering James teaching her to ride a bike in their driveway. "You've got this, Princess," he'd said, running alongside her. "I won't let you fall." He never did. The nephrology wing doors burst open as Grace arrived. Dr. Marcus, head of nephrology, intercepted her before she could reach her father's room. "Grace, I'm sorry, but you know the protocol. You can't be involved in his treatment." "Just tell me how bad it is," she pleaded, trying to maintain professional composure while her heart threatened to burst. "Acute renal failure. We're running tests, but he'll likely need a transplant." Sandra appeared, mascara streaking down her face, and collapsed into Grace's arms. Through the glass window, Grace could see James unconscious, surrounded by machines and tubes. She pulled out her phone, showing Sandra old family photos to distract her. James at Grace's high school graduation, beaming with pride. The three of them at their annual camping trips. Grace's medical school graduation, where James cried more than anyone else. "I want to check his charts," Grace said, reaching for the medical station computer. "You know I can't allow that," Dr. Marcus said gently. "Your family, not his physician." Grace nodded, fighting back tears. "Then I want to be tested for compatibility." Dr. Marcus hesitated. "Grace, I'm a doctor in this hospital. I know the protocols, the risks, everything. Just let me do this for my father." The preliminary tests took hours. Grace paced the waiting room, remembering James attending every single school play, science fair, and piano recital. He'd worked double shifts at his construction company to pay for her medical school, never once complaining. Sandra dozed fitfully in an uncomfortable chair while other doctors examined James. Grace watched through the window, feeling helpless. She remembered her medical school graduation, James hugging her so tight she could barely breathe. "You did it, Princess," he'd whispered. "You're going to save so many lives." The test results arrived in a plain manila envelope. Grace's hands trembled as she opened it, her medical training allowing her to interpret the data instantly. She stared at the results, her heart pounding. She was a compatible donor. Her eyes scanned the numbers again, double-checking every marker. Blood type, tissue compatibility, antigen matching, all aligned perfectly. The odds were astronomical, especially between non-biological relatives, yet there it was in black and white. Grace sank into the nearest chair, the paper trembling in her hands. A passing nurse touched her shoulder, concerned, but Grace barely noticed. Through the window, she could see James's chest rising and falling with mechanical precision, kept alive by machines while his kidneys failed him. Dr. Marcus appeared beside her, his expression grave as he looked at the results. "Grace," he began carefully, "you know this is just the beginning. The ethics committee will need to review this case carefully, given your unique family situation." The words hit her like a physical blow. Their unique family situation, a delicate way of addressing what some of her colleagues had been whispering about for years. She'd heard the comments, seen the raised eyebrows when she mentioned her parents, noticed the subtle assumptions that she must be adopted. Sandra stirred in her chair, blinking awake. "Grace, what is it?" "Mom," Grace said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm a match." Sandra's eyes filled with fresh tears as she wrapped her arms around her daughter. Through the window, one of James's monitors began beeping more urgently. Grace watched helplessly as another medical team rushed into his room, their movements swift and practiced. "You should both go home, get some rest," Dr. Marcus suggested. "We'll monitor him closely overnight." But Grace couldn't move. She remembered the night before her first day of medical school, how James had found her sitting on the back porch, terrified of failure. He'd brought her hot chocolate, just like when she was little, and told her stories about building skyscrapers, how every great structure started with a single brick. Now, watching the medical team stabilize her father's vital signs, Grace clutched the test results to her chest. She was no longer that scared 7-year-old girl, nor the nervous medical student. She was a doctor, a daughter, and possibly her father's only hope. The hospital corridors grew quieter as night fell. Sandra finally agreed to go home for a few hours, but Grace remained, her white coat now serving as a blanket as she curled up in the waiting room chair. The test results lay in her lap, their implications growing heavier with each passing hour. She stared fixedly at the compatibility results in her hands, her heart racing. She was a match. Grace's hands trembled as she clutched the compatibility test results, her footsteps echoing through the hospital corridors as she rushed to find the medical team. After years of medical training, she knew these numbers by heart. They were a perfect match. She burst into Dr. Thompson's office, her breath heavy with anticipation. "I'm compatible," she announced, holding out the papers. "I can save him." Dr. Thompson's expression remained carefully neutral as he examined the results. "Dr. Anderson, you know this isn't that simple. The ethics committee will need to review this case thoroughly." The first meeting with the ethics committee was scheduled for that afternoon. Grace sat straight-backed in her chair as 5 pairs of eyes studied her from across the long table. The memory of her first day at school flashed through her mind. The same questioning looks, the same unspoken doubts about her belonging to the Anderson family. "Dr. Anderson," Dr. Martinez began, his voice carrying a subtle edge. "Could you explain the nature of your relationship with the patient?" "James Anderson is my father," Grace stated firmly. "Your adoptive father," Dr. Martinez corrected, making a note on his pad. In the hospital cafe later that day, Grace found her mother Sandra quietly crying over an untouched cup of coffee. "They're trying to make it seem like we're not really family," Sandra whispered, her voice breaking. "After 25 years..." Walking back to check on James, Grace passed by a group of colleagues who immediately fell silent. Dr. Chen, however, broke ranks to catch up with her. "Grace, not everyone agrees with how they're handling this. Some of us are behind you." The support meant everything, but it didn't change the growing complications. While reviewing patient files, Grace discovered James wasn't first on the transplant list. There were 3 other patients with higher priority scores, their needs just as desperate as her father's. Sitting by James's bedside that evening, Grace held his unresponsive hand. "I'm not giving up, Dad," she promised. "Remember when you taught me to ride that bike? You said Andersons don't quit. Well, I'm still an Anderson." Dr. Martinez's questions became increasingly invasive during the follow-up meeting. "Could you provide details about the circumstances of your adoption? We need to verify all legal aspects." Grace spent that night digging through old documents at home, searching for anything that might help her case. Family photos spilled from manila envelopes, James teaching her to fish, her high school graduation, family vacations where their different skin colors meant nothing compared to their shared smiles. The next morning, Tension filled the hospital corridors. Grace overheard nurses whispering as she passed. It's not like they're really related. Their words stung, but she held her head high. A call to the adoption agency brought little comfort. Those records are quite old, Dr. Anderson. It might take weeks to locate everything. James's condition took a sudden turn for the worse that afternoon. His kidney function dropped dramatically, and Grace watched helplessly as other doctors rushed to stabilize him. Through the ICU window, she observed another family receiving joyful news about a compatible donor. Their tears of happiness twisted like a knife in her chest. Her phone buzzed with a new email notification. Irregularities found in adoption process must be clarified before any procedure can be approved. Grace sank into the nearest chair, her phone nearly slipping from her trembling fingers. Down the hall, she could hear the steady beep of her father's heart monitor, each sound a reminder of precious time slipping away. Dr. Thompson approached her cautiously. Grace, I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but we have to follow protocol. Protocol? Her voice cracked. He's dying, Richard. We both know his numbers are dropping faster than anyone expected. More nurses hurried past, their shoes squeaking against the polished floor. One of them, Marie, who had worked with Grace since her residency, paused briefly to squeeze her shoulder. The small gesture of support made Grace's eyes burn with unshed tears. Back in James's room, the evening sun cast long shadows across his pale face. Grace adjusted his blanket, remembering how he used to tuck her in at night, always making sure her feet were covered because they got cold easily. Now his own hands were cold to the touch. Sandra arrived with dinner Grace wouldn't eat. I brought those photos you asked for, she said, pulling out an old album. Look, here's the day we brought you home. James was so nervous he nearly dropped the camera. The photo showed a small girl with wide, uncertain eyes, clutching a worn teddy bear. Behind her stood James and Sandra, their faces glowing with joy. No one looking at that picture could doubt the love that radiated from it. I also found these, Sandra continued, producing a stack of letters. Every year on your adoption day, James wrote you a letter. He kept them all, saying he'd give them to you when you were older. Maybe they could help. Grace read through them with increasing desperation, searching for anything that might prove the legitimacy of their family bond. Each letter was filled with a father's love, documenting her growth, her achievements, her struggles. But would the committee see what she saw in these pages? Outside the room, Dr. A. Martinez walked past, his face unreadable as he glanced through the window. Grace watched him go, remembered his earlier questions. Don't you think it's rather convenient that you, a doctor at this very hospital, happen to be a match? The insinuation in his tone had been clear. The overhead speakers crackled with a code blue announcement in another ward, and Grace instinctively tensed, years of medical training urging her to respond. But she wasn't on duty now. She was just a daughter watching her father slip away, while bureaucracy and prejudice masked as protocol stood in their way. Her phone buzzed again, another email demanding more documentation, more proof, more validation of a relationship that had been real for 25 years. Grace closed her eyes, feeling the weight of every second ticking by, knowing that somewhere in this very building, someone was questioning whether her family was real enough to save. Grace's hands trembled as she rummaged through another dusty box in the Andersons' attic, desperate for any document that could validate her adoption. Old report cards, birthday cards, and family photos spilled onto the wooden floor, each one a testament to the life she'd shared with James and Sandra, yet none carrying the legal weight she needed now. Her phone buzzed. Another message from the hospital. James's fever had spiked during the night, and the infection was spreading faster than the antibiotics could fight it. Grace pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting back tears. She couldn't afford to break down, not now. I found something, Sandra's voice echoed from across the attic. She held up a manila envelope, its edges worn with age. Inside were photographs from the adoption process. Grace, age 7, holding hands with James and Sandra outside the courthouse. The social worker's business card was still paperclipped to one corner. Back at the hospital, Grace nearly collided with Dr. Thompson in the ICU corridor. His expression hardened as she approached. "Dr. Anderson, I hope you understand that your personal involvement in this case is causing concern among the staff." "My personal involvement?" Grace's voice shook with barely contained anger. "You mean my being his daughter?" "Your claimed relationship is precisely what we need to verify," he replied, emphasizing the word claimed in a way that made Grace's stomach turn. As she watched James through the ICU window, memories flooded back. She was 10, being pushed around on the playground by older kids who couldn't understand how she could be the daughter of white parents. James had shown up, not with anger or violence, but with such quiet dignity that even the bullies fell silent. "Family," he'd told her that day, "is about who shows up." Grace discovered through careful investigation that Dr. Martinez, a senior member of the ethics committee, had been deliberately slow-walking her case. Documentation that should have taken hours to process sat untouched on his desk for days. She caught his meaningful glances to other committee members, the way he emphasized unusual circumstances in meetings. The hospital cafeteria became a place of refuge and torment. Sandra collapsed there one afternoon, the stress finally overwhelming her. Grace held her mother as she sobbed, aware of the stares from other staff members. Some turned away, uncomfortable with the display of emotion. Others, like Nurse Rodriguez, who'd been there 20 years, came to offer quiet support. "We've seen this before," Rodriguez whispered to Grace later. "Not everyone believes family can look different than what they expect." Working her regular shifts became an exercise in emotional control. Grace caught the whispers that followed her through the halls. Some colleagues avoided eye contact, while others offered awkward smiles that felt more like pity than support. Late one night, exhausted from another day of fighting bureaucracy, Grace found herself searching through hospital records. Pattern emerged in Dr. Martinez's previous cases. Other families that didn't fit his narrow definition had faced similar delays and obstacles. James's condition deteriorated rapidly. The infection that had started in his lungs was now threatening other organs. Grace watched helplessly as more machines were wheeled into his room, each one beeping out the rhythm of her father's failing body. Sandra shared stories with the nurses, showing them pictures on her phone of Grace's graduation, family vacations, the day James taught Grace to drive. "Look how nervous he was," Sandra laughed through tears, pointing to James's white-knuckled grip on the dashboard. But he never gave up on teaching her. An old veteran nurse pulled Grace aside after one particularly difficult night. "I've been here 30 years, she said, "and I've learned that love doesn't always look the way people expect it to, but it's always worth fighting for." Grace eventually dozed off on the hospital lounge sofa, surrounded by medical journals and adoption paperwork. The sound of her pager jerked her awake. As she ran toward the ICU, Dr. Martinez's voice followed her. "Remember, Dr. Anderson, the appearance of favoritism could damage your career." The ICU alarm pierced through the hospital corridor. James's heart was failing. Grace burst through the ICU doors, her medical training warring with her emotions as she watched the team work on James. The monitors screamed their warning as his blood pressure plummeted. Dr. Chen, the attending physician, barked orders while nurses moved with practiced efficiency. "Starting chest compressions," a nurse announced, and Grace felt her own heart stutter at the sight of her father's lifeless body being pushed and pressed in the desperate fight to restart his heart. Sandra arrived moments later, clutching her rosary, her face pale with fear. Grace held her mother as they watched through the glass, both women silent in their shared terror. The minutes stretched like hours until finally, mercifully, the steady beep of the heart monitor resumed. "We've stabilized him," Dr. Chen explained, emerging from the room with sweat on his brow. "But he's much weaker now. The infection is winning, Grace. We need to move forward with transplant options immediately." Grace nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She knew what this meant. Time was running out. As she turned to comfort Sandra, she caught sight of Dr. Martinez watching from the end of the hallway, his expression unreadable. Back in her office, Grace pulled up the hospital's database, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she searched through old cases. There it was, a pattern she hadn't seen before. Over the past 5 years, every non-traditional family seeking transplant approval had faced extraordinary delays under Dr. Martinez's oversight. Some had never received approval at all. A soft knock at her door revealed a young resident, Dr. Sarah Kim. "Dr. Anderson, I have something you should see." She handed Grace a file, her hands shaking slightly. "These are copies of ethics committee minutes from previous cases. I noticed similarities to your situation." Grace's eyes widened as she read. The evidence was clear. Dr. Martinez had systematically discriminated against families that didn't match his traditional expectations. The weight of this discovery pressed on her chest like a stone. In James's room, the ventilator hissed rhythmically. Grace sat beside him, holding his hand, remembering how these same hands had steadied her bicycle, wiped away her tears, and applauded at every school play and graduation. Now they lay still, peppered with IV lines and tape. Sandra arrived with a box of old letters, recommendations from teachers, neighbors, and friends who had supported their adoption application years ago. "Look," she said, pulling out a yellowed envelope. "Remember Mrs. Johnson from next door? She wrote about how you and your father would spend hours working on that old car together." The memory hit Grace hard. 14-year-old her, covered in grease, learning about carburetors and timing belts from James, both of them laughing as they got everything wrong before they got it right. That car never did run properly, but the lessons about patience and perseverance had stayed with her. A cardiac monitor beeped more urgently, pulling Grace back to the present. Each faltering beat of James's heart was a reminder that their time was running out. She gathered the evidence she'd collected, straightening her white coat as she prepared to face the ethics committee one final time. The overhead speaker crackled, "Dr. Anderson to the ethics committee. Immediate attendance required. We have reached a decision." The shrill sound of medical equipment pierced through the ICU as James Anderson's heart monitor showed increasingly concerning patterns. Grace pressed her hands against the observation window, her medical training warring with her emotional turmoil as she watched the team work on her father. Dr. Wheeler, the attending physician, barked orders while nurses moved with practiced efficiency around James's bed. Through the glass, Grace could see the subtle signs of organ failure that any experienced doctor would recognize. Her father's skin had taken on a sickly pallor, his breathing shallow despite the oxygen support. She wanted nothing more than to burst through those doors and take charge, but hospital protocols and ethical constraints held her back like invisible chains. In the chapel downstairs, Sandra Anderson knelt in prayer, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Grace had just checked on her mother before returning to her vigil outside the ICU. The sight of her usually strong mother reduced to desperate prayers made everything feel even more surreal. "Dr. Anderson?" A quiet voice interrupted her thoughts. Grace turned to find Amy Chen, a first-year resident, clutching a manila folder to her chest. I thought you should see this." The young resident glanced nervously over her shoulder before handing over the folder. Inside, Grace found copies of ethics committee decisions from the past 5 years. Her eyes widened as she noticed a pattern in Dr. Martinez's voting record. Every case involving interracial families or adoptive parents had been met with concerns and delays. A memory flashed through Grace's mind. 16-year-old Grace in the passenger seat, James patiently teaching her to drive in an empty parking lot. "Everyone will tell you there's only one right way to do things. he had said, adjusting the mirror for her. "But sometimes the right way is the one that works for you, as long as you're not hurting anyone else." The confrontation with Dr. Martinez in the parking lot later that evening was inevitable. Grace caught him just as he was heading to his car, case files tucked under her arm. "Care to explain these statistics, Dr. Martinez?" Grace's voice was steady, despite the anger coursing through her veins. Martinez's face hardened. "I don't owe you any explanations, Dr. Anderson. The committee's deliberations are confidential." "Discrimination shouldn't be confidential," Grace countered, stepping closer. "These families deserved better." "You're emotionally compromised," Martinez sneered. "This is exactly why we have protocols." "Dr. Anderson?" Another interruption, this time from Dr. Sarah Collins, a senior resident who had been with the hospital for over a decade. She approached with determination in her steps. "We've all seen enough. Several of us are willing to testify about past cases." Back in James's room, Grace watched the monitors with increasing concern. Multiple organ failure was becoming a real possibility. She pulled an old family photo from his medical chart. It must have slipped in when Sandra was looking through his files earlier. The image showed 12-year-old Grace on James's shoulders at a baseball game, both of them beaming at the camera. As she stared at the photo, her phone buzzed with a text from Sandra. She had found James's old letters of recommendation from the adoption process. Finally, some documentation that could help their case. But Grace's momentary relief was shattered by the increasingly erratic beeping of James's heart monitor. Through the window, she could see the numbers dropping. Her medical training told her exactly what each declining value meant, making the experience even more excruciating. She pressed her hand against the glass, willing her father's heart to keep fighting. The floor nurse rushed past her into James's room, followed quickly by Dr. Wheeler. Grace felt her own heart pounding as she watched them work, feeling helpless in a way she'd never experienced before. As a doctor, she was used to being the one saving lives, not standing on the sidelines while someone she loved slipped away. Just then, her phone buzzed again. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw the message. "Dr. Anderson, the Ethics Committee requests your immediate presence. We have reached a decision." Grace's legs felt like lead as she made her way to the committee room. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, each step echoing in the sterile hallway while her father's life hung by a thread in the ICU. She clutched the folder of evidence against Martinez tightly, her knuckles white with tension. The walk to the committee room had never felt longer. She passed the nurse's station, where she had spent countless hours checking charts, the break room, where she had shared countless cups of terrible coffee with colleagues, and the bench where she had first sat with Sandra after getting the news about James's condition. Every familiar corner of the hospital now seemed charged with new meaning. Just before reaching the committee room, Grace paused at a window overlooking the hospital gardens. James had helped design those gardens years ago, volunteering his landscaping expertise to create a peaceful space for patients and families. Now, in the gathering dusk, the flowers he had chosen swayed gently in the evening breeze, oblivious to the drama unfolding above them. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Dr. Wheeler. "Patient stable for now, proceeding with emergency protocols." Grace took a deep breath, straightened her white coat, and opened the door to face whatever decision awaited her. The time for being just a daughter was over. Now she needed to be both doctor and advocate, ready to fight one last battle for her father's life. Inside the committee room, 7 faces turned to look at her. Dr. Martinez sat at the far end, his expression unreadable. The stack of files in front of Grace felt like a shield and a weapon both, evidence of years of subtle discrimination that had gone unchallenged for too long. Whatever their decision, she was ready to ensure this pattern would end tonight, one way or another. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she clutched the folder containing months of gathered evidence. Standing outside the ethics committee room, she took a deep breath, remembering James's pale face in the ICU. This was her last chance. She pushed open the heavy wooden door. The committee members sat around the long table, their faces a mix of stern professionalism and barely concealed prejudice. Dr. Martinez immediately stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "This meeting wasn't properly scheduled. We should—" "Let her speak," Dr. Thompson interrupted, surprising everyone. "Dr. Anderson has the right to present her case." Grace walked to the front of the room, spreading her documents on the podium. As she began setting up her presentation, Sandra burst through the door, followed by Margaret Wilson, their adoption case worker from 15 years ago. "I'm sorry I'm late," Sandra said, out of breath, "but I brought someone who needs to be heard." Before Dr. Martinez could protest again, other doctors began filing into the room. Dr. Chen from cardiology, Dr. Roberts from pediatrics, and several others, all colleagues who had worked with Grace over the years. They stood silently along the walls, a powerful show of support. Grace cleared her throat. "Before you make your final decision about my father's transplant, I want to show you what family really means." She clicked to the first slide, a photo of 7-year-old Grace at her first piano recital, James sitting proudly in the front row. "This is my father at every single performance I ever gave. He never missed one." Her voice grew stronger. "Not my biological father, my real father. The man who chose me, who loved me, who built me into the person I am today." She clicked through more photos. James teaching her to ride a bike, bandaging her scraped knee, helping with homework. Family isn't about matching DNA or skin color. It's about who shows up, who stays, who loves unconditionally. Dr. Martinez shifted uncomfortably as Grace moved to her next set of documents. "I've also discovered something disturbing. This hospital has a pattern." She began laying out case files, other families, other transplant denials, all involving mixed-race families or adoptive parents. A murmur ran through the room. Sandra stepped forward, holding up a stack of yellowed papers. "These are all the original adoption documents, recommendations, and home study reports. Every single one properly filed and approved." Margaret Wilson took the floor. "I personally handled the Anderson adoption. In 25 years of social work, I've never seen a more loving and committed family." The tension in the room peaked as one committee member stood up and removed his badge. "I can't be part of this anymore. This discrimination has gone on too long." He walked out, leaving his resignation letter on the table. Dr. Thompson leaned forward, studying the evidence of previous cases. His face grew darker with each page he turned. "Dr. Martinez, would you care to explain these patterns in your decisions?" Just then, a nurse rushed in. "Dr. Anderson, your father, his vitals have stabilized. He's showing improvement." Grace's eyes filled with tears as she delivered her final words to the committee. "That man in the ICU is my father, not because of papers or blood types, but because he chose to love a scared 7-year-old girl who had lost everything. Now I'm choosing to save him. The only question is, will you choose to do what's right?" The hospital director, who had been silently observing from the back, finally spoke. "I think we've seen enough. Dr. Anderson, the surgery is authorized, but there's one condition." The director stepped forward, his footsteps echoing in the now silent room. "The condition is that you'll help us revise our transplant policies after your recovery. We need someone with your perspective to prevent this from happening to other families." Grace nodded, tears streaming down her face as Sandra rushed to embrace her. The other doctors burst into applause, the sound reverberating off the wooden panels of the committee room. Dr. Martinez stood abruptly and left without a word, his chair toppling behind him. Dr. Thompson walked over to Grace, extending his hand. "I owe you an apology, Dr. Anderson. Sometimes it takes someone brave enough to stand up and show us our own prejudices." The nurse who had brought the news about James tugged at Grace's sleeve. "Your father's asking for you." Grace gathered her documents with trembling hands. the photos of her childhood scattering across the table. She paused to look at one. James pushing her on a swing. Both of their faces lit up with laughter. Sandra picked it up and pressed it into her daughter's hands. "Go to him," Sandra whispered. "I'll take care of everything here." As Grace hurried through the hospital corridors, her white coat flowing behind her, other staff members stopped to give her encouraging nods and smiles. News traveled fast in hospitals. By the time she reached the ICU, her pager buzzed with messages from the transplant team, ready to begin preparations. James lay in his hospital bed, his eyes clearer than they had been in days. When he saw Grace, he lifted his hand weakly. She rushed to his side, clutching his fingers. "Did you win?" he whispered hoarsely. Grace pressed her forehead against his hand, her tears falling onto the white hospital sheets. "Yes, Dad. We won." "That's my girl," he managed to say before drifting back to sleep, a slight smile on his face. Dr. Thompson appeared in the doorway, holding official surgery authorization papers. "The surgery is authorized, but there's one condition." Grace's hands trembled as she signed the consent forms, her signature less steady than usual. The weight of what was about to happen finally hit her. She would be both a doctor and a patient, daughter and donor. The sterile hospital room seemed to close in around her as she handed the clipboard back to the nurse. Walking to James's room for what could be their last visit before surgery, Grace paused at the doorway. Her father lay there, thin and pale against the white sheets, but still managing a weak smile when he saw her. Sandra sat in her usual spot, organizing old family photos spread across the small bedside table. "Look at this one," Sandra said, holding up a faded photograph. In it, a younger James stood waist-deep in a community pool, arms outstretched toward a terrified 7-year-old Grace. "Your first swimming lesson." Grace touched the photo gently, remembering that summer day. James had been so patient, spending hours in the water until she finally trusted him enough to let go of the pool's edge. "You never gave up on me, Dad," she whispered, squeezing his hand. The pre-op team arrived, efficiently checking vitals and preparing James for surgery. Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway, his presence casting a shadow over the moment. "I need to review some last-minute concerns about the procedure," he announced, his tone professional but his intent clear. "Everything has been cleared by the ethics committee," Grace stated firmly, standing between him and her father's bed. "The surgery is scheduled for 8 a.m. tomorrow." After Martinez reluctantly left, Grace took out her phone and recorded a video message for James. "Dad, I'm doing this because you taught me what it means to be family. Remember when you told me that love doesn't care about matching DNA or skin color? You were right. You've always been right." The surgical team gathered in the conference room, reviewing the procedure step by step. Dr. Thompson, now an unexpected ally, led the discussion. Grace watched from the back, both as a medical professional and as a daughter, her worlds colliding in this moment. Sandra had fallen asleep in the chair beside James's bed, an old photo album open on her lap. Grace carefully removed it, placing it on the table. The images spanning 15 years of their life together, birthdays, graduations, ordinary moments that built their extraordinary bond. In the pre-op room, Grace underwent her own battery of tests. Blood work, chest x-rays, final cross-matching, each procedure bringing her closer to the point of no return. The nurse taking her blood pressure smiled sympathetically. "You're usually on the other side of these tests, aren't you, Dr. Anderson?" Grace changed into a hospital gown, the familiar fabric feeling foreign against her skin. She found herself in the hospital chapel, not praying exactly, but finding strength in the quiet. The stained glass windows cast colored shadows across the floor, reminding her of the way life's challenges could create unexpected beauty. The surgical prep team worked efficiently, setting up instruments and checking equipment. Grace watched them through the window, her medical knowledge both a comfort and a curse. She knew every step, every risk, every possibility for complications. James was transported to pre-op, looking small and vulnerable on the gurney. Grace followed, still in her gown, breaking protocol to walk beside him until they reached the restricted area. "I love you, Dad," she whispered, touching his hand one last time before they were separated. As Grace lay on her own gurney, the anesthesiologist checking her IV line, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. From the day the Andersons chose her to this moment, their bond had never been about biology. It had always been about choice, about love, about family in its truest form. The head surgeon entered the prep room, his expression grave. "Dr. Anderson, we've discovered a last-minute complication." Grace's heart monitor spiked at the surgeon's words. "Your father's white blood cell count has risen significantly in the last hour," he explained, reviewing the latest lab results. "We may need to delay the procedure until we determine the cause." The fluorescent lights seemed to buzz louder as Grace processed this information. All their fighting, all their progress, hanging by a thread because of an 11th-hour complication. She sat up on the gurney, her medical mind racing through possibilities. "Show me the results," she demanded, temporarily forgetting her role as patient. The numbers were concerning but not catastrophic. It could be stress-induced. His cortisol levels would naturally be elevated before major surgery. Dr. Thompson arrived, summoned by the developing situation. He reviewed the labs, his expression thoughtful. "I agree with Dr. Anderson's assessment. The elevation isn't significant enough to indicate infection. I recommend we proceed as scheduled." Time seemed to slow as they waited for the final decision. Grace lay back down, remembering James teaching her to face challenges head-on. "Sometimes the hardest part is the waiting," he used to say. "But that's when we show what we're made of." The surgical team huddled in the corner, discussing options in hushed tones. Sandra appeared at the door, still clutching her rosary, worry etched deep in her features. The same worry Grace had seen 15 years ago when James had taught her to drive, both of them returning home 2 hours late because she'd been too scared to go above 20 milliliter. Finally, the head surgeon returned. After reviewing all factors and consulting with the transplant team, they would proceed. The relief in the room was palpable. The anesthesiologist resumed his preparations, adjusting medications and checking monitors. "Count backward from 10, he instructed, starting the anesthesia. As Grace felt consciousness slipping away, her last thought was of James teaching her to swim, his strong hands supporting her, his voice steady and sure. "I've got you, sweetheart. I've got you." The world faded to black as the operating room staff moved around her with practiced efficiency, preparing for the procedure that would either save her father's life or change their family forever. The fluorescent lights of the operating room cast harsh shadows as Grace was wheeled in on the gurney. Her heart raced, not from fear for herself, but for James, who was being prepared in the adjacent operating room. Through the fog of pre-anesthetic medication, she caught glimpses of familiar faces behind surgical masks, colleagues who would now hold her life, and her father's, in their hands. "Count backward from 10, the anesthesiologist instructed, his voice steady and professional. Grace began counting, her medical training making her acutely aware of each step of the process. As consciousness slipped away, her last thought was of James teaching her to ride a bike, his strong hands holding the seat, promising never to let go. In the waiting room, Sandra clutched her rosary, her fingers moving mechanically from bead to bead. The worn wooden crosses had been her companion through countless nights of worry, but none quite like this. Other families waited nearby, their own anxieties creating a thick atmosphere of shared concern. Grace floated in and out of consciousness, fragments of memories mixing with present reality. She was 7 again, crying after falling off her bike, and James was there, cleaning her scraped knee with such gentleness. Then she was in medical school, calling him late at night, devastated after losing her first patient. His voice had been her anchor then, just as it had been throughout her life. In the operating rooms, 2 surgical teams worked with precision. The rhythmic beeping of monitors created a tense symphony. Dr. Thompson stood overseeing both procedures, his experienced eyes moving between the 2 rooms through the connecting window. "BP dropping in OR2, a nurse called out. The team working on James increased their pace. Blood bags were rushed in, their deep red contents a stark contrast against the sterile white and blue of the operating room. Sandra jumped at every sound of running feet in the corridor, each rushed movement sending her heart into her throat. Other families in the waiting room offered quiet support. A tissue, a gentle pat on the shoulder, a cup of bitter hospital coffee. Grace's vital signs wavered unexpectedly. "She's having a reaction to the anesthesia," someone called out. The anesthesiologist adjusted quickly, his movements precise and controlled. In her sedated state, Grace's mind wandered to a summer afternoon when James had taught her to swim, his voice calm and encouraging as she fought against her fear of the water. The crucial moment arrived, the transfer of the kidney. Surgeons in both rooms coordinated their movements with practiced efficiency. The precious organ was moved quickly but carefully, every second critical to its survival. Through the haze of anesthesia, Grace's consciousness flickered. She was in her childhood bedroom, James reading her a bedtime story. She was at her medical school graduation, seeing his proud tears. She was in the hospital cafeteria, sharing lunch breaks with him before his illness took hold. The transplant team worked methodically, connecting vessels, checking perfusion, ensuring every detail was perfect. Nurses moved like dancers in a choreographed performance, anticipating needs before they were voiced. In James's operating room, the tension mounted. His blood pressure became erratic, causing concern among the surgical team. More medications were administered, more adjustments made. The next few minutes would be crucial. Sandra felt each minute stretch into eternity. She remembered the day they'd brought Grace home, how James had spent weeks preparing the perfect bedroom. Now, both her husband and daughter lay on operating tables, their lives intertwined more deeply than ever before. The surgery proceeded into its final stages. Grace's team began closing, while James's team continued monitoring his response to the transplanted kidney. Everything seemed to be proceeding according to plan until James's heart monitor emitted a long, continuous tone. "Code blue in OR2. The call echoed through the operating suite. Dr. Thompson's hands moved with practiced urgency, directing his team as they fought to stabilize James. The defibrillator pads were placed on his chest, the machine charging with its distinctive whine. "Clear!" The first shock sent James's body arching off the table. The monitor continued its ominous tone. In the adjacent room, Grace's surgery was completing, her body accepting the changes with surprising resilience. Unaware of the drama unfolding next door, her vitals remained stable, her breathing steady under the anesthesia. Again, "Clear!" Another shock. The surgical team held their breath, watching the monitor. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. A blip appeared, then another. Slowly, steadily, James's heartbeat returned, each peak on the monitor a small victory. The tension in OR2 began to dissipate, replaced by focused determination as the team returned to completing the transplant procedure. Sandra felt a shift in the air of the waiting room before anyone came to speak to her. Years of being a doctor's wife had given her an intuition about these moments. When Dr. Thompson finally emerged, still in his surgical garb, his expression was carefully neutral. "Both surgeries are complete," he said, sitting beside her. "There were some complications with James, but we managed to stabilize him. Grace came through beautifully. They're both being moved to recovery." In the post-op room, Grace and James were placed in adjacent beds, their monitors beeping in an almost synchronized rhythm. The nurses moved efficiently between them, checking vitals, adjusting medications, recording every detail. As the anesthesia began to wear off, Grace's fingers twitched slightly. In his bed, James remained still, his chest rising and falling with the help of a ventilator. The next 24 hours would be critical for both of them. The night shift began, and the hospital quieted. Sandra sat between their beds, her hand alternating between holding Grace's and James's, her prayers never ceasing. The rosary beads clicked softly in the dim light, a quiet counterpoint to the steady beeping of the monitors. Outside the recovery room, Dr. Thompson updated the surgical team. "We almost lost him," he said quietly. "But he's fighting. They both are." He looked through the window at the family he had come to know so well, the devoted wife, the determined daughter, the resilient father, and knew that their battle wasn't over yet. The monitors continued their vigil through the night, each beep a reminder of the delicate balance between life and death, each moment a testament to the strength of family bonds that transcended blood and biology. James's heart monitor continued its steady rhythm, each beat a defiant answer to the silence that had threatened to end it all. The first sensation Grace felt was a distant beeping sound, followed by the familiar antiseptic smell of hospital rooms. Her throat felt dry, and her body seemed impossibly heavy. Through the haze of post-anesthesia, she could make out Sandra's silhouette moving between two hospital rooms, her footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor. "Water," Grace managed to whisper, and a nurse immediately appeared with ice chips. As consciousness fully returned, the events of the past hours came rushing back. The surgery, her father, James. "How is he?" she asked, her voice stronger now. "Your father's initial tests are showing positive signs," the nurse replied with a gentle smile. "Dr. Thompson is personally monitoring both of you." Grace closed her eyes, and suddenly she was 7 years old again, learning to ride a bicycle. James was there, his steady hands holding the back of her seat, running alongside her. "I won't let go until you're ready," he had promised. But when she finally looked back, he was standing 20 feet behind her, beaming with pride as she pedaled on her own. The memory faded as Dr. Thompson entered her room, clipboard in hand. "The surgery went well, Grace. Your father's new kidney is showing excellent early functions. You did good, kiddo." Throughout the day, a steady stream of hospital staff dropped by her room. Some brought flowers, others just wanted to squeeze her hand or share a word of support. News had spread quickly about the battle she had fought to save her father, and the subsequent changes it was bringing to the hospital's policies. She heard that Dr. Martinez had submitted his resignation that morning. The news brought no joy, only a sense of closure. The system was changing, and that was what mattered most. By evening, Sandra brought the news that made Grace's heart soar. James had opened his eyes. Despite the nurses' protests, Grace insisted on being wheeled to his room. There he was, pale but alive, his eyes finding hers immediately. "My brave girl," he whispered, his voice rough from the intubation. Sandra moved between their rooms like a guardian angel, adjusting pillows, checking monitors, and updating concerned callers. The nurses had thoughtfully arranged for Grace to be moved to the room next to James's, making it easier for Sandra to care for both. "The whole hospital's talking about you two," one of the night nurses confided while checking Grace's vitals. "You're showing them what family really means." Grace dozed off that evening, to the sound of nurses chatting in the hallway, discussing how the Anderson case would change transplant policies forever. She woke briefly when James was brought in for another round of tests, and their eyes met across the room. He couldn't speak around the oxygen mask, but he lifted his hand slightly, the first voluntary movement since the surgery. The following morning brought more flowers, more cards, and more visitors. The head of cardiology stopped by to say they were already revising their family donor protocols. The chief resident brought a group of interns, using their case as a teaching moment about challenging systemic barriers. Sandra arrived with fresh clothes and Grace's favorite novel, settling into the chair between their rooms with her ever-present photo album. She showed the nurses pictures of Grace's medical school graduation, of family vacations, of countless moments that proved family bonds transcend genetics and skin color. By afternoon, James was strong enough to manage a smile, weak but unmistakable. Grace felt tears rolling down her cheeks as she watched him through the glass partition. They had done it. They had beaten not just the illness, but the prejudice and bureaucracy that had nearly kept them apart. That evening, as Grace was finally allowed to sit up in bed, she noticed an envelope on her bedside table. She reached for it, wondering who might have left it. Opening the crisp white paper, she pulled out a single sheet of paper containing just one line. "This isn't over yet." Grace stared at the note, her hands trembling slightly. She glanced around the room, searching for any sign of who might have left it. The evening shift nurses were busy at their station, and visitors had long since gone home. Only Sandra remained, dozing in the chair between the two rooms. A shadow of unease crept over her initial euphoria. She tucked the note under her pillow, not wanting to worry her mother. The monitors beeped steadily, reminding her that despite any lingering threats, the most important battle had been won. James was alive, recovering, and the surgery had been successful. Through the glass partition, she could see her father sleeping peacefully. The oxygen mask had been replaced with a nasal cannula, another small victory. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, each breath a testament to their shared victory. Dr. Thompson entered, checking both their charts. "Your latest blood work is excellent," he said quietly. "Both of you are exceeding expectations." Grace nodded, her mind still on the mysterious note. But as she watched her father breathe, as she listened to her mother's soft snores, as she felt the dull ache in her side that meant life and hope and connection, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The night settled over the hospital wing, and Grace finally allowed herself to drift off to sleep, the note's threat diminishing in the face of their family's strength. Whatever wasn't over, they would handle it. They always had. Through her window, she could see the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, another life hanging in the balance, another family waiting and hoping. But here, in these two adjacent rooms, healing had already begun, not just of bodies, but of an entire system that needed to change. The night nurse dimmed the lights, checking their IVs one last time. Grace closed her eyes, letting the rhythmic beeping of the monitors lull her to sleep. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they were all exactly where they needed to be, together, alive and stronger than ever. Grace adjusted her position in the wheelchair as she was pushed toward the hospital's main conference room. 3 weeks had passed since the surgery, and while her body still ached, her spirit was stronger than ever. The familiar corridors now held a different meaning, each step marking not just her physical recovery, but the beginning of something bigger. The conference room fell silent as she entered. Board members and department heads turned to face her, their expressions a mix of respect and curiosity. Grace took a deep breath and began sharing her story, not just as a doctor, but as a daughter who had fought against an outdated system. In the rehabilitation wing, James was making remarkable progress. His physical therapist noted how his determination seemed to grow stronger with each session. "Just like my daughter," he would say, proudly, to anyone who would listen. The nurses couldn't help but smile at how he mentioned Grace in every conversation. Sandra had found her own mission during this time. She started organizing weekly meetings for adoptive families in the hospital's community center. "Every family has a unique story," she would tell the participants, "and each one is equally valuable." The group quickly grew from 5 families to 20, creating a support network that extended beyond the hospital walls. The transformation within the hospital was palpable. Dr. Thompson had taken Grace's case as a catalyst for change, implementing new protocols that looked beyond biological connections when evaluating transplant cases. The Anderson case, as it became known, was already being cited in medical conferences across the country. One afternoon, Grace found herself looking through a stack of speaking invitations. Medical schools, hospitals, and ethics committees all wanted to hear her story. But it was the small note from a young adoptive mother that brought tears to her eyes. "Your fight gave us hope." In her office, Sandra discovered a box of old thank you letters from families James had helped over the years. Each letter spoke of his kindness, his support, his ability to see beyond surface differences. Reading them, Sandra realized that their family's story was part of a larger pattern of love transcending boundaries. The first family meal after the surgery was a milestone moment. The hospital cafeteria had reserved a special corner, decorated with flowers from the staff. James, still moving carefully but smiling broadly, sat between Grace and Sandra. Other doctors and nurses stopped by, not just to check on their recovery, but to share how their story had impacted their own perspectives on family and medicine. Grace found herself increasingly involved in similar cases, offering guidance and support to families facing their own battles with the system. Each case strengthened her resolve to ensure that no other family would face the same obstacles she had encountered. As James regained his strength, he began taking short walks through the hospital corridors. Staff members who had known him for years saw something new in his eyes, a deeper understanding of the patient experience, a first-hand knowledge of the vulnerability and strength required to heal. The hospital's transplant criteria underwent a complete overhaul. Grace worked closely with the ethics committee to establish new guidelines that recognize the complexity and diversity of modern families. The changes were met with overwhelming support from both medical staff and patients. One particularly memorable moment came when Grace led her first case review under the new guidelines. A young girl needed a kidney transplant, and her stepfather was a match. Under the old system, they might have faced obstacles. Now, they were approved within days. The celebration in the hospital wing was spontaneous and heartfelt. Staff members gathered to commemorate not just the successful recovery of the Andersons, but the broader changes their story had inspired. Sandra brought her famous homemade cookies, and James told stories that had everyone laughing and wiping away tears. Grace sat in her office late one evening, reviewing the new protocols she had helped develop. The wall behind her desk now displayed family photos alongside her medical degrees, a visual reminder of why she had fought so hard. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Dr. Thompson, holding an envelope with the hospital board's letterhead. "Grace, would you accept the position as the new ethics committee chairperson?" Grace stared at the envelope in Dr. Thompson's hands, her heart racing. The position would mean more than just a promotion. It represented an opportunity to ensure lasting change in the system she had fought so hard to reform. "We need someone with both medical expertise and personal understanding," Dr. Thompson continued, taking a seat across from her desk. "Someone who knows firsthand that medicine isn't just about procedures and protocols. It's about people." Through the window of her office, Grace could see James taking his evening walk in the hospital garden, Sandra by his side. They moved slowly but steadily, stopping occasionally to greet other patients and their families. The sight reminded her of all they had been through, all they had overcome. "The board's decision was unanimous," Dr. Thompson added, placing the envelope on her desk. "Your experience has shown us where we need to improve, and your leadership during this entire situation has impressed everyone." Grace reached for the envelope, her fingers tracing the hospital's embossed logo. 3 months ago, she had stood before this same committee, fighting for the right to save her father's life. Now they were offering her the chance to prevent others from facing similar battles. "The position would start next month," Dr. Thompson explained. "We want to give you time to fully recover and transition into the role. Of course, you'll maintain your clinical duties, but with a reduced schedule to accommodate the new responsibilities." As she opened the envelope and read through the official offer, Grace felt tears welling in her eyes. The salary and benefits were generous, but it was the outlined scope of authority that moved her. The power to implement real change, to ensure that family bonds would be recognized in all their beautiful complexity. Looking up at Dr. Thompson, Grace nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When she finally found her voice, it was steady and clear. "Yes," she said. "I accept." Grace stood before the mirror in her office, adjusting her white coat. The nameplate on her desk now read, Dr. Grace Anderson, Ethics Committee Chair. The morning sun filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over the framed family photos that lined her shelves. She took a deep breath, remembering how far they'd come. Downstairs, James was completing his final checkout procedures. After months of recovery, his vitals were strong, his color was good, and most importantly, his eyes sparkled with the same warmth they'd had since the day he'd first welcomed her into his home. Sandra fussed over his discharge papers, triple-checking everything as she always did. "Ready to go home, Dad?" Grace asked, entering the room. James looked up with a smile that reached his eyes. "More than ready, sweetheart." The drive home was filled with Sandra's excited chatter about the welcome party she'd organized. As they turned onto their street, Grace couldn't help but remember another drive. 20 years ago, when a scared 7-year-old girl sat in the back seat, clutching a worn teddy bear, wondering if this new family would really want to keep her. The house was decorated with balloons and welcome home signs. Friends, family, and hospital staff had gathered to celebrate. James's eyes welled up as he walked through the door to applause and cheers. Sandra had outdone herself, with photographs from their family history decorating every surface. Grace found herself drawn to one particular photo, James at her white coat ceremony, beaming with pride. That was the day she'd told him she wanted to be a doctor, inspired by his own battle with health issues over the years. "You'll be the best doctor this city has ever seen," he'd said, and she'd believed him because James Anderson had never lied to her. The following week, Grace presided over her first ethics committee meeting. The conference room felt different from this side of the table. As she introduced new inclusive policies, she caught Dr. Thompson's approving nod. The same room that had once been a battlefield was now a place of positive change. At home, James gradually returned to his beloved garden. Grace visited every evening after work, often finding him tending to his roses. "These blooms are stronger than ever," he said one evening, "just like us." They shared a knowing look, both understanding that some things had to be broken down to grow back stronger. The hospital organized a special ceremony to inaugurate the new transplant wing. Grace stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of colleagues who had become family. James and Sandra sat in the front row, hands clasped together. "Today marks not just the opening of a new wing," Grace began, "but the beginning of a new era in healthcare. One where we recognize that family bonds transcend biology, where we understand that love creates the strongest connections of all." Sandra had surprised everyone by creating a memory album of their journey. During the reception, people gathered around it, marveling at the photographs. Young Grace on James's shoulders, family vacations, holidays, and finally, the hospital photos documenting their shared recovery. The most powerful moment came when James, still moving carefully but standing tall, embraced Grace in front of everyone. There was no hesitation, no self-consciousness about their different skin colors or the whispers that had once followed them. They were simply father and daughter, bound by something far stronger than genetics. As the new protocols took effect, Grace found herself mentoring a young doctor, facing a similar situation with her adopted mother. "Sometimes the hardest battles teach us the most important lessons," she advised, sharing her experience with a new generation of medical professionals. One sunny Sunday, the entire Anderson family gathered in James's garden. Sandra brought her famous lemonade, and they sat among the blooming flowers, sharing stories and laughter. Grace watched her parents, her real parents in every way that mattered, and felt complete. The culmination came at the resident graduation ceremony. Grace stood at the podium, looking out at the eager faces of new doctors ready to begin their journeys. Her family sat in the audience, just as they had at every important moment of her life. Family isn't measured by the color of our skin or the blood in our veins, but by the love that flows through our hearts, she said, her voice strong and clear. It's measured in the sacrifices we make for each other, in the battles we fight together, and in the bonds that grow stronger with every challenge we face. Looking at her father's proud smile, Grace knew that every struggle had been worth it. They had not just changed hospital policy, they had shown the world what family truly means. Family isn't measured by the color of our skin or the blood in our veins, but by the love that flows through our hearts. Grace Anderson, in her inaugural speech as Ethics Committee Chair. The applause echoed through the auditorium as Grace concluded her speech. Young doctors wiped tears from their eyes, and several older physicians nodded in silent acknowledgement. She could see the impact of her words reflected in their faces, a new understanding of what it meant to be both a medical professional and a human being. After the ceremony, residents lined up to speak with her, sharing their own stories of family struggles and medical ethics dilemmas. One young doctor, her eyes bright with determination, told Grace how the Anderson case had inspired her to specialize in transplant medicine. Back in her office, Grace added a new photo to her wall, one taken just moments after her speech, with James and Sandra flanking her, their faces glowing with pride. The sunlight caught the frame of her new Ethics Committee certification, casting rainbow patterns across her desk. A knock at the door revealed Dr. Thompson. "Your father's case has changed more than just our hospital," he said, handing her a folder. "3 other major medical centers have adopted our new family evaluation protocols. You've started something remarkable, Dr. Anderson." Grace smiled, remembering the frightened doctor she'd been just months ago, fighting against a system that couldn't see beyond blood ties. Now, sitting in her office as Ethics Committee Chair, she understood that sometimes the greatest medical breakthroughs weren't about new procedures or medications, but about changing hearts and minds. James and Sandra were waiting for her in the hospital garden, their new tradition for family dinners. Her father had helped design this space during his recovery, insisting that patients needed a place of beauty and peace. The roses he'd planted were in full bloom, their petals catching the evening light. "Ready to go home, sweetheart?" James asked, just as he had thousands of times before. But now these words carried the weight of everything they'd been through, everything they'd overcome together. Grace took one last look at the hospital building behind her, her second home, the place where she'd nearly lost her father, and where they'd both been reborn. She smiled, taking her parents' hands in hers. They walked together through the garden, their shadows merging in the setting sun, a family bound not by blood, but by something far more powerful: unconditional love.